For over a century, every scientist, every museum, every Jurassic Park movie had the same T-Rex. They were all wrong. You think those tiny arms were a mistake of evolution, a vestigial embarrassment that nature simply forgot to fix. The science now says the opposite. Those arms were the point. Think about that. The one thing everyone laughs at, those ridiculous little arms, might be the single most important evolutionary feature this animal ever developed. By the end of this video, I'm going to show you exactly why, using a study that analyzed 82 dinosaur species and was published just 10 days ago. Subscribe if you want the science that doesn't make the news cycle. New video every week. This is how science works when the public isn't watching. Museums inherit old models. New fossils get published in journals that sit behind paywalls and academic jargon. And the gap between what scientists know and what everyone else believes grows wider every decade. You learned that T-Rex stood upright like a human, dragging its tail like a third leg. That was the vision of Henry Fairfield Osborn in 1905. He looked at that first skeleton and saw something like a giant kangaroo. Body erect, tail on the floor, arms so disproportionately small he initially suspected they might belong to a different animal entirely. This was the version that went into every textbook, every museum diorama, every natural history illustration for the next 80 years. It felt authoritative because it came from the most respected paleontologist of his era. It was the best available model from the evidence at the time. It was also substantially wrong. It took until the late 1980s for the scientific community to accept the horizontal posture. Head forward, tail acting as a counterbalance, body parallel to the ground. That correction happened nearly 100 years after the first skeleton was described. Some museums didn't update their mounts until the 2000s, which means the image most of us carry from childhood, from school trips, from textbooks, from the dinosaur section of every museum we ever visited, was already outdated before we were born. But there's a second myth that's even harder to shake, and it comes directly from a movie you've probably seen more than once. Jurassic Park says the T-Rex only sees movement. Stand still and you disappear. It's one of the most iconic moments in cinema history. It's also wrong in almost every detail. Endocranial casts, three-dimensional maps of the brain cavity produced from fossilized skulls using CT scanning, tell a completely different story. The olfactory bulbs of a T-Rex were enormous, proportionally larger than almost any living predator on record. This was not an animal that navigated the world primarily through sight. It lived in a world of invisible chemical signatures, detecting the presence of prey or carrion from miles away, moving through the landscape with the systematic precision of a biological tracking system. It didn't need you to run. It could smell you standing still from half a mile away. Its eyes were positioned forward in the skull, providing strong binocular overlap and depth perception comparable to modern raptors. The visual system was not weak, but it was the backup. The primary interface with the world was chemical. The movie got it completely backwards. The T-Rex was not a creature fooled by stillness. It was a sensory machine that could locate you in dense fog, in total darkness, through a mile of forested river delta, using a sense we don't even have a meaningful human equivalent for. The idea that standing still would save you is the kind of myth that can only emerge when scientists aren't in the writer's room. We spent decades asking what T-Rex used its arms to grab. We were asking the wrong question. We assumed the arms were a tool that failed. The fossil record suggests they were a deliberate sacrifice. To understand why, we need to look at the study published in May 2026 by researchers at University College London and the University of Cambridge in the journal Proceedings of the Royal Society B. The team, led by doctoral researcher Charlie Scherer, analyzed 82 theropod species, the two-legged, mostly carnivorous group of dinosaurs, examining the relationship between forelimb length and skull robustness across the entire evolutionary tree of this group. What they found was not a quirk specific to T-Rex. It was a pattern, appearing independently in 5 completely separate dinosaur lineages. Not once. 5 times. That's convergent evolution. That's nature arriving at the same solution through entirely different routes. in unrelated species across tens of millions of years of independent development. And every single time it happened, the result was identical. Smaller arms, more robust skull, stronger bite. The Tyrannosaurids, the family that includes T-Rex, showed an even, proportional reduction across the entire forelimb. Upper arm, lower arm, hand, all shrinking together at a consistent rate. The Abelisaurids, which includes animals like Carnotaurus from South America, showed a completely different developmental pattern. Only the lower arm and hand shrank, while the upper arm remained large. Same endpoint, two different pathways. Because the selection pressure driving both groups was identical, skull-jaw dominance as the primary hunting interface. Type arms in the comments if you always assumed the tiny arms were an evolutionary accident. Or jaws if you already suspected the skull was the trade-off. I read everyone. Scientists just studied those 82 species to figure out the exact developmental mechanism behind that trade-off. The answer is right after this. Welcome back. Here's exactly what the mechanism reveals. The teeth of a T-Rex were not like the thin, blade-like slices of most large carnivores. They were thick, conical, and deeply rooted, anchored in the jaw like structural pillars. They didn't function like knives, they functioned like railroad spikes, not slicing through material, but driving through it, through hide, through muscle, through bone, without snapping. The serrations on the edges weren't there for cutting. They were there for gripping, for locking into bone and preventing the prey from pulling free. Most large predators in history avoided crushing bone. Shattering a tooth in the field means a slower, more painful death by starvation. The risk is too high. T-Rex did the opposite. It routinely pulverized bone. We know this because its fossilized droppings, coprolites, contain bone fragments. And the skull was built specifically to handle the load that generates. The bones of the upper jaw were fused together tightly, creating a structure that transferred the force of the bite across the entire skull rather than concentrating it at any single point. It wasn't just the most powerful bite in the history of terrestrial life. It was structurally engineered to use that power without destroying itself. You cannot build a skull that size, with that bite force, with that tooth architecture, and simultaneously maintain the muscle mass required to move large functional arms. The metabolic cost alone would be prohibitive. The head became the weapon. The arms were the price. Evolution doesn't like to have everything at once. It prioritizes. And for T-Rex, it prioritized the skull so completely that the arms became something evolution simply stopped investing in. Think of the whale. Its ancestors lost their hind limbs entirely as they committed to the ocean and redirected every available biological resource into a body plan that made them the largest animals ever to live on this planet. T-Rex did something structurally similar on land. It shed the weight and metabolic cost of functional forelimbs to redirect that energy into a skull capable of 12,800 pounds per square inch of bite force, the highest recorded for any terrestrial animal in the history of this planet. The arms didn't fail, they were traded. Now we need to talk about how long this animal actually lived, because this is where a second major revision from 2026 changes how we read every specimen in every museum collection on Earth. Dinosaur bones grow in rings, like trees. Count the rings, estimate the age. For decades, the standard model said T-Rex lived approximately 30 years and reached full size between 20 and 25. Fast growth, short life, peak early, and then decline. That was the accepted version. It appeared in papers, textbooks, and exhibit labels at every major natural history museum. A 2026 study published in Peer re-examined 17 T-Rex specimens using expanded histological sampling, taking more cross-sections from more bones than any previous analysis had attempted. The finding, some growth rings were being systematically missed in prior work. The bones had a structural complexity that earlier sampling methodology didn't fully capture. The revised lifespan, 35 to 40 years, with growth continuing well past what the previous model classified as maximum size. This matters more than it might initially seem. The standard model wasn't just a number on a label, it was the foundation for every inference about T-Rex behavior, reproductive strategy, and population dynamics. If the animal lived a decade longer than we thought, and continued growing past what was classified as maturity, then the specimens we've been studying as fully grown adults may be something closer to adolescence in their final growth phase. The dominance hierarchy within T-Rex populations, the age at which they reached reproductive maturity, the ratio of juveniles to adults in the fossil record. All of it is potentially based on a developmental timeline that needs to be redrawn, which means specimens currently labeled as fully mature adults in museum collections were likely still growing when they died. The animal, displayed behind the glass, described in exhibit text as a prime adult at the peak of its power, may have been midlife. Everything that label says about the biology of the animal is built on a lifespan that the most current data has revised by a decade. Type older in the comments if this surprised you, or younger if you already thought 30 years sounded too short for an animal this size. And then there's what researchers found inside the bones themselves, something that changes not just how old T-Rex was, but what kind of animal it fundamentally was. In April 2026, a team published findings in scientific reports confirming the presence of preserved blood vessels inside the fossilized bones of Scotty, the T-Rex specimen from Saskatchewan that holds the record for the largest individual ever found. Not DNA, not soft tissue in the conventional sense, but the organic structures that once housed blood, flexible branching tubular networks, preserved in silica and mineral over 66 million years. The architecture of those vessels is more consistent with a warm-blooded, high-metabolism animal than with the cold-blooded reptile model that dominated paleontology through most of the 20th century. The debate about T-Rex metabolism isn't new. Scientists have argued about it for 30 years. But physical evidence of vascular structure preserved inside the bone itself is new. It's not a model. It's not an inference from footprint spacing or bone density. It's an organic structure that survived geological time, and it tells a story about how this animal was powered from the inside. We spent 120 years studying T-Rex from the outside. Bones, teeth, footprints, bite marks on prey, trackway spacing to estimate gait. What we're building now is from the inside out, and the animal that emerges from that approach looks fundamentally different from anything the 20th century imagined. The Hell Creek Formation, where most of the best T-Rex specimens have been found across what is now Montana, South Dakota, Wyoming, and Saskatchewan, was not an open savanna. It was a dynamic, swampy river delta. Humid, seasonally flooded, heavily forested with conifers, palms, and dense fern undergrowth. A landscape of shifting river channels, muddy floodplains, and dense vegetation that would have made open country pursuit hunting essentially impossible for an animal of this size. A creature weighing 6 tons doesn't hunt by outrunning prey across open ground. It hunts by using the environment. The biomechanics support this. The massive pelvic musculature of T-Rex, the anchor point for the muscles driving its stride, was built for explosive acceleration over short distances, not sustained speed. The center of mass was positioned for powerful burst movement, not chase, ambush, concealment in the dense vegetation of the delta, patience, and then an explosive closure of distance followed by a strike that was, by every physical measure, an execution rather than a fight. And these animals paid a physical price for the lives they lived. The specimen known as Sue, the most complete T-Rex skeleton ever recovered, shows healed bite marks on her skull inflicted by another T-Rex. She survived that encounter. The bone had healed completely before she died, which means she lived for years after being attacked by an animal identical to herself. Stan, another extensively studied specimen, shows evidence of a broken and fully healed neck vertebra, an injury that in any modern animal would be classified as potentially fatal. He survived it. He kept hunting. Both of these animals bled, healed, fought, and continued operating in one of the most competitive predatory environments in the history of vertebrate life. They were not pristine apex predators. They were survivors. If you learned about T-Rex before 2015, you learned a version built entirely from the outside in. What the bones looked like, how the muscles attached based on attachment scars, how fast it moved based on footprint spacing. What we're building now, with preserved blood vessels, with revised lifespans, with CT-mapped sensory systems, with healed injury evidence from named specimens, is from the inside out. And the animal emerging from that evidence is stranger. more biologically sophisticated, and more ecologically specific than anything the 20th century managed to imagine. Here's what the 2026 Royal Society study ultimately proved. The answer to the question that has been open since Henry Fairfield Osborn first looked at those tiny arms and didn't know what to make of them. When the forelimbs shrank, the center of mass shifted forward. The skull, already becoming the primary weapon, could be deployed faster, with more precision, with less competing mass pulling against it. A T-Rex without functional forelimbs was more lethal than a T-Rex with them. Not because the arms were useless, because their absence made the skull more mobile, more responsive, and more devastating. The removal was functional. The smallness was the point. The skull reached up to 5 feet in length in a fully grown adult. The bite force exceeded 12,800 pounds per square inch, enough to crush bone, which T-Rex did routinely, while most other large predators of any era avoided bone entirely to protect their own teeth. The arms were the price of the most powerful skull in the history of terrestrial life. Consider the scale of what that represents. The study found this same trade-off, forelimb reduction correlated with skull dominance, in 5 completely independent lineages, across different continents, across tens of millions of years of independent evolution. Carnotaurus in South America, Tyrannosaurids in North America and Asia. 5 separate experiments by evolution, all arriving at the same answer. That's not coincidence. That's a law. When an animal specializes its skull as a primary weapon to the degree that T-Rex did, the arms become a liability. Not because they stop working, the muscle attachments in T-Rex suggest the arms retained significant grip strength, but because the metabolic cost of maintaining them outweighs any marginal benefit they could provide. Evolution is ruthless about that calculation. And in T-Rex, the calculation was settled 80 million years ago. T-Rex didn't lose something, it traded. And what it got was the ability to be the apex predator of an entire continent for millions of years. Every species makes trade-offs. The ones that endure are the ones that trade well. And T-Rex made one of the most consequential and successful trades in the evolutionary history of vertebrate life on this planet. The T-Rex you learned about, the upright, scaly, slow-moving creature with pathetic vestigial arms and a visual system defeated by stillness, was a product of the questions scientists were asking at the time. The T-Rex that 2026 is building has preserved blood vessels in its bones. It lived a decade longer than we thought. It navigated its world through an olfactory map we cannot perceive. It hunted by ambush in a flooded delta forest. Its teeth were structural pillars designed for crushing bone. And those tiny arms were the evolutionary signature of the most optimized predatory skull in the history of life on land. If this changed how you see this animal, subscribe, because every week on this channel we take an animal the world thinks it understands and show you what the most recent science actually says about it. The next animal on this channel survived for 20 million years and made every other predator in its ocean completely irrelevant. Scientists just found a tooth that changes the size estimate entirely. It's right here. The T-Rex was never the animal in the movies. It was something stranger, something more optimized, and something we are still learning how to see.